The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the prestigious St. Augustine's Academy. Emily Green, her worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder, wiped a bead of sweat from her brow. Her reflection in the gleaming black car barely registered a smudge of faded denim and tired eyes against the polished surface. Inside, a quiet hum of anxiety vibrated. This was the second week she had picked up Momo from school, a simple task that felt like navigating a minefield of privileged disdain. The air itself seemed thick with the unspoken rules of wealth and status, a world she had once inhabited but now observed from a distance, a ghost in her own past. The driver's side door of a sleek, silver Bentley swung open, and Simon Lee emerged. His tailored suit, crisp and immaculate, screamed of bespoke tailoring. He paused, adjusting his cufflinks, a flicker of annoyance crossing his impeccably groomed features. His gaze landed on Emily, and his lips curled into a sneer. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice laced with a chilling condescension that felt like a physical blow. Emily's hand tightened on the cleaning cloth. A wave of humiliation washed over her, a familiar sting. "I'm waiting for my daughter," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, the words catching in her throat. A bitter taste filled her mouth. This man, this stranger, once knew her intimate secrets, the cadence of her laughter, the way her heart beat against his. Now, he looked at her as if she were something unpleasant clinging to the sole of his expensive shoes. "Waiting?" Simon echoed, his brow furrowed. He surveyed her from head to toe, his expression a mixture of disgust and amusement. "You look like you're about to wash the car. Such a country bumpkin." He chuckled, a short, derisive sound. "No manners at all." He glanced at his watch, a gesture that radiated impatience. "Get lost." The dismissal, so casually cruel, pierced through Emily's carefully constructed composure. A surge of anger, hot and sharp, coursed through her veins. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to rip away the mask of polite indifference he wore so effortlessly. But years of practiced restraint held her back. This wasn't the time, not the place. Momo would be here any minute, and the last thing Emily wanted was for her daughter to witness this humiliating exchange. "I am waiting for my daughter, Momo Lee," she repeated, forcing a semblance of calm into her voice. Each word was a small victory against the tremor of anger that threatened to consume her. She met his gaze, her own hardening. Beneath the surface of her worn exterior, a steel core began to solidify. Simon blinked, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Momo Lee." He repeated the name slowly, as if tasting it for the first time. He looked at her again, a slow, deliberate appraisal. The realization dawned on him, and his expression shifted from disdain to something akin to malicious amusement. "You?" he scoffed, a cruel laugh escaping his lips. "You think you can just show up here, dressed like that and claim to be picking up Momo?" Emily clenched her jaw, her fingers digging into the cleaning cloth. She could feel the stares of other parents, the whispers, the silent judgment. They were all watching, feeding off her humiliation. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, and Simon was the conductor. He wanted to break her, to crush her spirit beneath the weight of his contempt. He wanted to erase her, to pretend she never existed. "I am her mother," she stated, her voice low but unwavering. The words hung in the air, a challenge, a declaration of war. A small figure appeared at the school gates, her bright eyes scanning the crowd. "Momo." Relief flooded through Emily, momentarily eclipsing the burning anger. Simon followed her gaze and his smirk widened. "Momo, darling," he called out, his voice dripping with false affection. He moved towards the girl, effectively cutting Emily off. Momo hesitated, her eyes darting between her mother and her father. The uncertainty on her young face was a knife twist in Emily's gut. A hand landed on Emily's shoulder, a warm, comforting pressure. And Grant, her friend, stood beside her, her expression a mixture of concern and anger. "Simon, what is going on here?" she asked, her voice sharp. Simon waved a dismissive hand. "Just a misunderstanding," he said, his eyes glinting with malice. "This woman seems to be confused." He turned his attention back to Momo, his voice softening. "Come along, darling. Let's not keep the driver waiting." Before Simon could usher Momo away, a figure stumbled out of the shadows, a bottle clutched in his hand. He swayed slightly, his clothes rumpled, his hair disheveled. "Emily, my dear girl," he slurred, his voice loud and boisterous. He wrapped an arm around Emily, pulling her close. "Don't let these pompous peacocks bother you." He hiccuped, his breath heavy with the stench of alcohol. Simon recoiled in disgust. "What the who is this vagrant?" he sputtered, his face contorted in a mask of revulsion. The vagrant straightened, his eyes suddenly sharp and focused. He tossed the bottle aside, the glass shattering against the pavement. The sound, sharp and unexpected, silenced the murmuring crowd. He looked at Simon, his gaze cold and piercing. "I am Carl Green," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "Emily's father." He turned to Anne, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Miss Grant, I presume?" Anne nodded, her eyes wide with surprise. She had met Carl once, years ago, before the downfall. He had been a titan of industry then, the formidable head of the Emperor Group. The man standing before her now bore little resemblance to the powerful figure she remembered. Yet, the steel in his eyes, the unwavering strength in his voice, was unmistakable. Simon's face paled. He stammered, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. "Emperor Group," he whispered, the words barely audible. Emily took a deep breath, the years of suppressed anger finally finding release. She met Simon's gaze, her own burning with a cold fire. "Yes, Mr. Lee," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am Emily Green, owner of the Emperor Group. And you, sir, are about to face the consequences of your actions." The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath. Whispers rippled through the assembled parents, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. Simon stood frozen, his face ashen, the blood drained from his lips. He looked at Emily, at Carl, then at Anne, his eyes darting back and forth like a trapped animal. Momo, her small hand clasped tightly in Emily's, looked up at her mother with wide, wondering eyes. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated pride. The biting wind whipped strands of Emily's hair across her face, stinging her cheeks. Each gust felt like a tiny slap, mirroring the humiliation burning within her. Simon's words, laced with venom, echoed in the growing silence. He stood there, a monument to his own arrogance, his posture radiating the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he held all the cards. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the escalating drama. Whispers, like the rustle of dry leaves, skittered around her. Emily's fingers tightened around Momo's hand. The small warmth of her daughter's hand was the only anchor in the storm raging inside her. "He thinks he's won. He thinks he can still control me." The thought pulsed in her, a bitter counterpoint to the fear that trembled at the edges of her composure. Anne's voice cut through the tension. "Simon, that's enough. You're being unreasonable." Emily felt a flicker of gratitude. Anne, at least, seemed to recognize the ugliness unfolding. But even that small comfort was quickly extinguished. "Unreasonable?" Simon scoffed, his eyes glinting with malice. "This woman," he gestured towards Emily with a dismissive flick of his wrist, "this cleaner dared to lay a hand on my precious Sophia. And you're defending her?" He turned his attention to Anne, his sneer deepening. "Isn't this our high school beauty? And Grant," he paused, letting his gaze sweep over Anne's expensive car, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Driving a luxury car makes you superior. Anne's face flushed. Emily saw her jaw clench, the elegant composure she usually maintained beginning to crack. He's enjoying this, Emily realized, her stomach twisting. He's feeding off our discomfort. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear into the cold afternoon air, but Momo's small hand in hers held her rooted to the spot. Simon, Anne said, her voice strained, this isn't about superiority. It's about basic decency. Decency? Simon laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You think decency matters to someone like her? He leaned closer to Anne, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You know, the school board holds its next meeting next week. I could put in a word. Suggest little Ethan might not be suited for such a prestigious institution. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emily saw the blood drain from Anne's face. He wouldn't, she thought, even as a cold certainty settled in her stomach. He absolutely would. Simon, she knew, was a master manipulator. He wielded his wealth and influence like weapons, crushing anyone who dared to challenge him. I am superior to you, so what? Emily heard herself say, the words escaping before she could stop them. The tremor in her voice betrayed her inner turmoil, but a strange sense of defiance had begun to bloom within her. He can't keep doing this. Simon rounded on her, his eyes blazing. What did you say? Emily took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, stealing her resolve. This ends now. Just as she was about to unleash the torrent of words she'd held back for so long, a new voice interrupted. Superior, you say? The voice, gravelly and laced with amusement, came from the edge of the gathering crowd. A figure emerged, a man dressed in shabby clothes, his hair disheveled, reeking faintly of alcohol. It was Carl, her father, still maintaining his disguise. Emily's heart leaped into her throat. What is he doing? Simon, momentarily diverted, turned his attention to the newcomer. And who are you, old man? Carl swayed slightly, feigning drunkenness, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He fixed Simon with a steady gaze. Just an observer, he slurred, of this fascinating display of human interaction. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. Then, his gaze shifted to Anne, and his expression changed subtly. A flicker of something unreadable passed across his features. And Grant, he said, his voice suddenly clear and resonant, "Nay Middleton, if I'm not mistaken." And froze, her eyes widening in surprise. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Emily's mind raced. Middleton? What is he talking about? Carl continued, his voice now carrying an edge of authority that belied his disheveled appearance. Daughter of the late Arthur Middleton, the disgraced banker who misappropriated certain funds, shall we say? The air thickened with tension. Anne's face was ashen. Simon stared at Carl, his mouth agape. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. Emily felt a knot of confusion tighten in her chest. What game is he playing? Carl's gaze swept over the assembled faces, his expression hardening. He straightened, the air of a drunken vagrant falling away, replaced by something sharp and dangerous. You think driving a fancy car makes you superior? He directed the question at Simon, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife. You think your money gives you the right to treat people like dirt? He turned to address the entire Lee family and their associates. You preen and posture, flaunting your wealth, blind to the real world, the real struggles of ordinary people. He gestured towards Emily. This woman, the one you despise, the one you call a cleaner, he paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. Is Emily Green, the sole owner of Emperor Group? A collective gasp went through the crowd. Simon's face paled, his eyes darting from Carl to Emily, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. Anne's shock quickly morphed into something else, something akin to awe. Emily felt a surge of triumph, a potent cocktail of vindication and relief. Carl continued, his voice ringing with authority. The company you so desperately tried to court, the one you thought would elevate your pathetic little empire belongs to her. He turned to Anne, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. And as for your little problem, Miss Grant Emperor Group happens to be a major shareholder in the bank that holds Eurospan's considerable debts. I believe a word in the right ear will resolve your schooling difficulties. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind still whipped around them, but the whispers had ceased. The Lee family, their arrogance shattered, stood frozen, like statues caught in the sudden glare of a spotlight. Emily, holding Momo's hand tight, looked at her father, a wave of gratitude washing over her. He had orchestrated this perfectly, turning their humiliation into a public spectacle. The game, she realized, had just begun. And she, for the first time in a long time, held all the cards. The afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt, baking the air with a thick, cloying heat. Emily stood frozen, the echo of Simon's words ringing in her ears, a cruel symphony of arrogance and disdain. Clean his car. Kneel down and clean his car. A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm her. Her fingers curled into fists, the nails digging into her palms, a small, desperate act of resistance against the humiliation that coiled in her gut. He thinks he can still command me. He thinks I'm still that nobody. The thought was a bitter pill, coated in the residue of years of suppressed resentment. Momo's small hand tugged at hers, her wide, frightened eyes searching Emily's face. It was a silent plea, a desperate anchor in the storm of adult cruelty that raged around them. And in that moment, Emily knew. For Momo, she would endure. For Momo, she would swallow her pride, and yes, even clean his damn car. Okay, she said, the word a choked whisper, barely audible above the murmur of parents collecting their children. She could feel the curious stares, the whispers, the silent judgment of the onlookers. Each one a tiny pinprick, deflating the fragile bubble of her composure. She forced herself to meet Simon's gaze, her own eyes burning with a cold fire he couldn't possibly comprehend. He smirked, a triumphant glint in his eyes. He enjoys this, she realized, a sliver of ice forming in her heart. He enjoys seeing me like this. The Maybach gleamed obscenely in the sunlight, a monument to his wealth and her supposed degradation. Emily could almost smell the leather, the expensive air freshener, the very essence of his smug superiority. She felt a surge of anger, a hot, pulsating wave threatening to break through her carefully constructed facade. Breathe, Emily. Breathe. She knelt, the act itself feeling like a betrayal, a surrender to his petty tyranny. She took the cleaning cloth he offered, the fabric almost offensively soft against her roughened hands. Her stomach churned. Each swipe across the gleaming paintwork felt like a physical blow, a chipping away at her dignity. This is not you, Emily. The thought echoed in her mind, a defiant whisper against the rising tide of humiliation. And stepped forward, her face etched with concern. Simon, this is ridiculous. Emily doesn't need to do this. Her voice was firm, a small act of defiance in the oppressive atmosphere. Simon merely chuckled, waving her away dismissively. Stay out of this, Anne. This is between me and the help. He emphasized the last word, drawing it out with a sneer that made Emily's blood boil. Momo stood silently beside Anne, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. Her small body trembled, her eyes fixed on Emily with an unsettling mixture of fear and confusion. Emily forced a smile, a weak, brittle thing that felt alien on her face. It's okay, Momo. Mama's okay. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Across the road, a figure stirred beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree. A bottle clinked softly against the pavement. Carl, disguised in his usual attire of a disheveled drunkard, watched the scene unfold with narrowed eyes. He had seen enough. He straightened, a subtle shift in his posture that belied the apparent lethargy of his demeanor. The amusement he'd feigned for weeks now had evaporated, replaced by a steely resolve. Enough is enough. As Emily continued her degrading task, she heard a car pull up beside Simon's Maybach. A sleek, black Rolls-Royce, its presence radiating power and prestige. The chauffeur emerged, opening the door for a tall, imposing man. Carl. But not the Carl they knew. Gone were the tattered clothes, the unkempt beard, the vacant stare. He stood before them, impeccably dressed, his eyes sharp and alert, his bearing radiating an aura of authority that made Simon falter. "What's going on here?" His voice, usually slurred and mumbled, now resonated with a deep, commanding tone. Simon, momentarily stunned, stammered, just dealing with some domestic matters. His usual arrogance seemed to melt away under Carl's intense gaze. Carl's eyes flicked to Emily, then back to Simon. "Is that so? And who might this domestic be?" "Just the cleaner," Simon said dismissively, his voice regaining a sliver of its former arrogance. "She spilled coffee on my car." He gestured towards Emily with a flick of his wrist, a gesture that spoke volumes about his ingrained sense of superiority. A ghost of a smile played on Carl's lips. "The cleaner, you say?" He turned to Emily, his eyes softening. "Emily, darling, is this true?" Emily, still kneeling beside the Maybach, looked up at Carl, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment had arrived. She straightened, discarding the cleaning cloth onto the ground. She met Simon's shocked gaze, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Simon," she said, her voice now clear and steady, "let me introduce you to my father, Carl Green, chairman of the Emperor Group." The color drained from Simon's face. He stared at Carl, then at Emily, his eyes wide with disbelief. The realization of what he had done, the magnitude of his mistake, crashed down on him like a tidal wave. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Carl turned his attention to the gathering crowd. "And while we're at it," he announced, his voice carrying over the stunned silence, "let me also introduce you to my daughter, Emily Green, the sole heir to the Emperor Group, and the woman you, Simon Lee, so cruelly discarded for $700 million. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. $700 million, he repeated, his voice laced with a chilling disdain. "This car of mine is worth over $400,000 a Maybach." He gestured towards the Rolls-Royce. "My daughter's private jet is worth considerably more. Perhaps next time, Mr. Lee, you'll think twice before you insult someone based on their perceived social standing." The opulent chandeliers cast a warm, inviting glow across the polished marble floors of the restaurant, reflecting in the pristine silverware laid out on crisp white tablecloths. The air hummed with the low murmur of conversation, punctuated by the clinking of glasses and the soft strains of a live piano melody. To Emily, it felt like stepping into another world, a world where the air itself vibrated with money and privilege. A world she had deliberately left behind, but tonight, she was back. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a gilded cage. Momo, clutching her hand, gazed around with wide, curious eyes, seemingly oblivious to the subtle disdain in the gazes of the immaculately dressed patrons. A tall, slender woman with a perfectly coiffed updo and a dress that shimmered like liquid moonlight approached them, her smile tight and strained. "Madam," she began, her voice smooth as silk but laced with a subtle chill, "I'm afraid your attire isn't quite suitable for our establishment." Emily felt a familiar sting of humiliation, a heat rising in her cheeks. Her simple blouse and jeans, perfectly acceptable anywhere else, suddenly felt like a shameful brand in this temple of elegance. She glanced down at Momo, whose small hand tightened in hers. "We have a reservation," Emily replied, her voice quieter than she intended. She fumbled in her purse for the reservation confirmation, her fingers trembling slightly. "Yes, I see that," the woman conceded, her eyes flicking over Emily's worn purse with barely concealed distaste. "However, we do have a dress code." A pause, weighted with unspoken judgment. "Perhaps you could return another time, more appropriately attired." Emily's stomach clenched. She could feel Momo's small body tense beside her. This wasn't about the dress code. It was about who she was, or rather, who they perceived her to be: a nobody. A cleaner. Someone who didn't belong in their rarefied world. Before Emily could respond, a familiar voice sliced through the air. "Emily? What are you doing here?" Simon Lee, her ex-husband, stood a few feet away, his expression a mixture of surprise and thinly veiled contempt. He was flanked by his current wife, a stunning woman dripping in diamonds, and several other members of the Lee family, all radiating an air of effortless superiority. Emily's breath hitched. This was not how she'd envisioned the evening. She'd hoped to avoid any confrontation, to simply enjoy a quiet dinner with Momo. Now, it seemed, a storm was brewing. "We have a reservation," Emily repeated, her voice gaining a touch of steel. Simon's lips curled into a sneer. "A reservation? Really? Are you kidding?" He chuckled, a sound that grated on Emily's nerves. "Do you know our minimum spend here? I doubt you could afford a glass of water, let alone a meal." The Lee family joined in his laughter, their eyes glinting with malicious amusement. Momo hit her face against Emily's leg, her small body trembling. Emily felt a wave of protective anger surge through her. She would not let them humiliate her child. Not again. "I assure you, I can afford it," Emily said, her voice calm despite the turmoil within. She pulled out a sleek black card from her purse, the same card she rarely used, a symbol of a life she had tried to leave behind. The laughter died abruptly. The restaurant hostess's eyes widened, her perfectly composed facade cracking. Simon's face paled. He recognized the card. Everyone in their circle recognized the card. "This," Emily said, holding up the card, "is the world's only supreme black card." "The limit?" "Let's just say it's more than enough to cover a few dinners here." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. $700,000, to be precise. Silence descended upon the group, thick and heavy. The air, once filled with their condescending laughter, now crackled with a different kind of energy: fear. Simon stammered, That's impossible." "Where did you get that?" Emily met his gaze, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "Does it matter?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with a newfound authority. She turned to the hostess, who now looked like a deer caught in headlights. "I believe we have a table waiting." The hostess, her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and awe, quickly led them to the best table in the restaurant, overlooking the city lights. As they were seated, and Grant, a friend Emily had confided in earlier, approached their table, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and amusement. "Emily," she exclaimed, "I saw what happened. You were magnificent." Emily managed a small smile, her heart still pounding in her chest. She could feel Momo's small hand relax in hers, her daughter's eyes shining with a mixture of pride and wonder. Across the room, the Lee family sat frozen, their faces a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. They had underestimated her, dismissed her as a mere cleaner. They had no idea who she really was. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The charade was over. It was time for the truth to come out. She opened her eyes, a newfound sense of purpose settling in her gaze. This was just the beginning. From the corner of her eye, Emily saw a disheveled figure approach. A familiar figure she had instructed to remain out of sight unless absolutely necessary. It was Carl, her father, disguised as a wandering drunkard. He staggered slightly, muttering to himself, before stumbling towards their table. The Lee family watched, their expressions a mixture of disgust and confusion. Emily held her breath, bracing for the next act of this unfolding drama. The storm she had unleashed was far from over. It was only just gathering force. The opulent restaurant, shimmering with crystal chandeliers and hushed whispers of wealth, felt like a cage. Emily's stomach churned, not from the exquisite food before her, but from the simmering rage that threatened to boil over. Simon's condescending laughter grated on her nerves, each chuckle a sharp reminder of the years she'd spent trying to please him, only to be met with disdain. He thinks he's won, she thought, her hand tightening around her water glass. He thinks I'm still the meek Emily he could control. Across the table, Momo's small frame trembled slightly. Emily saw the fear in her daughter's eyes, mirrored by the rising protectiveness within her own heart. It was time. You dare show up in front of me? The words, though quiet, hung in the air, silencing the nearby conversations. Simon's laughter died abruptly, replaced by a look of bewildered indignation. What's this, Emily? Playing hard to get now? He sneered, dismissing her words as a desperate attempt to reclaim his attention. He doesn't understand, Emily thought, a flicker of cold amusement crossing her face. He has no idea what's coming. Anne, sitting beside Emily, shifted uncomfortably. Her attempts to mediate earlier had been brushed aside, leaving her caught in the crossfire of a battle she didn't fully comprehend. Simon, maybe we should, she began, but Emily cut her off. No, Anne. Let him speak. Let him dig his own grave. The ice in her voice startled everyone at the table. I'll never trust you again, Simon spat, the mask of civility finally cracking. After what you did, running away like a coward, his words were fuel to the fire burning within Emily. Running away? She echoed, her voice laced with a dangerous calm. I was protecting my daughter from your toxic influence. I'll leave right now, Simon declared, pushing back his chair with a theatrical flourish. He thought he was dismissing her, discarding her as he'd done countless times before. But this time was different. Someone informed Jade Group to revoke his position as general manager, Emily said, her voice level and unwavering. The air in the restaurant thickened, the silence punctuated only by the clinking of silverware. Simon froze, his face contorting in disbelief. What did you say? He stammered, the arrogance draining from his features. I'm the general manager of Jade Group, Emily replied, meeting his gaze with an unwavering stare. The color drained from Simon's face as the realization hit him. The whispered conversations around them resumed, now laced with shock and speculation. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. The Lee family's carefully constructed facade crumbled under the weight of Emily's revelations. News of Simon's dismissal spread like wildfire, followed by whispers of their financial troubles and shady business dealings. Their social standing, once their most prized possession, evaporated overnight. Emily watched it all unfold from a distance, a strange sense of detachment washing over her. This isn't about revenge, she told herself, it's about justice. For Momo. For myself. Momo, initially bewildered by the sudden shift in power dynamics, gradually blossomed. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a newfound confidence. At her new school, a modest but welcoming building a world away from the gilded cages of her past, Momo found a friend in Mr. Taylor, a kind teacher who saw her potential and nurtured her spirit. This house is so big. Momo exclaimed, her small hand clasped in Emily's as they explored their new home. It wasn't a sprawling mansion like the Lee family's estate, but it was filled with warmth and laughter, a sanctuary from the storm. "It's just $700,000, Emily replied, a soft smile playing on her lips. The amount, once an insurmountable sum, was now a mere fraction of her vast wealth. But the true value lay not in the price tag, but in the piece it represented. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place at a charity gala. Emily, dressed in a simple yet elegant gown, stood beside her father, Karl. He'd shed his disguise of a wandering drunkard, revealing himself as the formidable patriarch of the Emperor Group. The whispers in the crowd intensified, their shock palpable as they realized the extent of Emily's power and influence. Even Anne, who had known Emily's secret, was taken aback by the sheer magnitude of her friend's true identity. Mr. Taylor, invited as Emily's guest, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and admiration. Emily, catching his eye, smiled warmly. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Taylor," she said later, offering him a position at the newly established Emperor Group Foundation, a philanthropic endeavor focused on education and child welfare. Mr. Taylor, touched by her generosity and recognizing the opportunity to make a real difference, accepted without hesitation. The night concluded with a quiet conversation between Emily and her father. "You did well, my dear," Karl said, his voice filled with pride. Emily leaned against him, a wave of exhaustion finally washing over her. The battle was won. She had reclaimed her life, protected her daughter, and exposed the hypocrisy of those who had underestimated her. As she closed her eyes, a single thought echoed in her mind: this is just the beginning.